So the last video that we're going to go through for social psychology covers a few of the other topics that social psychology addresses, including obedience, attributions, and stereotyping and prejudice. Now, once again, because this is a broad survey class, we're only going to be spending a week on social psychology, whereas I spent an entire semester teaching social psychology, and I spent 6 years studying it in graduate school. So this is a very rich topic that's full of information. We're just doing a very broad overview of the big picture sorts of topics that social psychology addresses. So obedience is contrasted with conformity and compliance because it is changing behavior at the command of an authority figure. Compliance is changing behavior at someone's request. Would you purchase this product? And conformity is changing behavior as a result of an unspoken cue from other people that provides social pressure. Obedience is response to a direct order from an authority figure. So the Milgram study that I had you read for this week is all about obedience. So the Milgram study is one of the articles that I've asked you to read this semester and one of the articles that you need to read by the end of the week. I hope that you do. It's a very interesting study and very compellingly written. The Milgram study is a classic study in obedience. I'm going to give a very broad overview here, but I do hope that you read the article in full, and I've also included a video that you can watch about it as well. The very basics. Participants were brought into the study and were told that they were doing a study on learning, and they were assigned to be the teacher in the experiment. They were also introduced to another man who was assigned the role of learner, and the experimenter informed them that the learner was expected to learn a series of word pairings, that every time he had an error, the teacher was expected to give him a shock. There was a board set up that started with 15 volts and went all the way to XXX, danger, severe voltage, over the course of several intervals that moved up by 15 volts at a time. And basically, every time the learner made the mistake, the teacher was expected to give him an increased level of shock. Now, the learner was a Confederate, was a plant that was set there by the experimenter ahead of time, and that gave a set number of errors that would lead the teacher to give an increasing series of shocks over the course of an hour, or maybe even less, so that after a certain amount of time, they were giving higher and higher degrees of shocks. The learner also claimed at a certain point to have heart trouble and banged on the wall and yelled, and then fell silent and refused to answer any more questions, leading the teacher to presume that the person in question was either being challenging or was potentially unconscious or suffered a heart attack. Participants found this experience very intense, and their reactions indicated they were under a great deal of stress, and they found the experiment incredibly realistic. And what the results showed was about 60% of participants were fully obedient. By fully obedient, that means that they went to the end of the shocks that were possible to give at the maximum voltage and only stopped the experiment when they were told that the experiment was over. Milgram was looking to see how many people would get out of their chair and refuse to give any more shocks, or would protest enough that they could cause an end to the experiment. But 60% of people continued to give shocks despite the clear distress that it caused them. So we've explored this particular phenomenon, and we know a few things about it. First of all, there's no apparent differences in personality in terms of who is fully obedient and who is not. The fact that it is a gradual commitment makes it a little bit like that frog in boiling water, where the temperature gradually rises until you're kind of stuck, and because you've committed to it, it's very hard for people to back out. Also, because there's an authority figure, it makes it that much harder. One of the things that Milgram posited was that the teacher identified more with the experimenter than the learner, and as a result, it was harder for them to see what the learner was going through and to empathize with them. Another factor that Milgram talked about was the fact that the study took place at Yale. He actually did a follow-up version in a strip mall, and he did another version where the experimenter was actually a fellow participant in the study who was a fellow Confederate, but who seemed to be just another person off the street, to see if that would reduce the number of people that were fully obedient. And indeed, those factors did serve to reduce full obedience, but still not eliminate it altogether. Another factor that we studied is how far away people were from the learner. So for example, they did versions of the study where people were in the same room as the learner, and another version where they had to press the learner's hand onto a plate themselves in order to give them a shock. And what they found is that the closer someone was to a learner, the less likely they were to be fully obedient. It still didn't eliminate it to zero, though. So to switch gears a little bit to our second topic in this video, from obedience to attribution. So hopefully you have some food for thought when it comes to the Milgram study that you can talk a little bit more about in your discussion forum. But let's go ahead and move on to attribution. Attribution is the process by which we explain our own behavior and other people's behavior. Now, one of the fun things about attribution is it doesn't necessarily have to be based on fact. Rather, it can be based on our understanding of what we think was the reason behind someone's behavior. And what we think was the reason is often falling into a very distinct and predictable pattern. So when we attribute someone's behavior, we have two different possibilities in terms of a potential reason why. The first potential reason why someone behaved the way that they did, we can determine is due to what's known as a situational cause, where we determine that the cause of their behavior is due to external factors. So for example, if someone cut you off in traffic, then you could say, oh, I must have been in their blind spot. They must not have seen me. That's a situational cause. Another choice that we can make is a dispositional cause. We can determine that the reason that they behaved the way that they did was because of internal factors related to who they are. So for example, if someone cut us off in traffic, we could also say it's due to the fact that they're a bad driver, or it's due to the fact that they're a terrible person, or it's due to the fact that they're a member of a group that is stereotypically expected to be bad at driving. Now, one of the key things about this is that we can either pick one or the other. And it's usually most of one or the other. We don't tend to be very good at looking at a mix of these things. We tend to either pick one or the other when it comes to our decisions. And you might guess which one we tend to pick more often. If someone cut you off, are you more likely to go, "Ooh, I guess they didn't see me," or "Gosh, that person's a bad driver"? Here's a hint, it's the second one. This is actually known as the fundamental attribution error, where we're far more likely to overestimate the influence of internal or dispositional factors and underestimate situational factors when it comes to other people's behavior. We're a lot more likely to go, that person's a terrible driver, than we are to go, oh, I guess they just didn't see me, because of the situation. Now, this is a cultural phenomenon. People from individualistic cultures are a lot more likely to experience the fundamental attribution error. People from collectivistic societies are a lot more likely to take into account the greater cultural context, and as a result are less likely to fall prey to this particular bias. Age also plays a factor. As people get older, they're far more likely to make dispositional attributions. Okay, the last topic we're going to cover is prejudice and discrimination. This is also, once again, one of those enormous topics that has a lot of richness and a lot of research, and we're only going to cover it for a couple minutes. So this is a very broad overview of a fascinating topic that I wish we could spend a little bit more time on. So prejudice can be thought of as a negative attitude that's held by a person about members of a particular social group. Discrimination is our behavior. So you can think of prejudice as a feeling and discrimination as behavior, where you treat people differently because of the prejudice you hold. And of course, stereotypes are our thoughts, the belief systems that we have that associates a group of people with certain traits. These stereotypes are usually fairly broad and are based in historical connotations, but are not necessarily based in fact. One of the things that I talk about extensively in my social psychology class is that you can map the types of stereotypes that people hold to the relative power of the people in the groups that are being stereotyped. And so if you take a look, for example, at the stereotypes people hold in Europe towards the Polish or the Roma, there are very negative stereotypes about those groups that don't necessarily exist in the United States because we don't have the same sort of historical power dynamics. Stereotypes tend to be connected to relative power, so that we have very consistent stereotypes about people in positions of low power, usually that they're lazy, aggressive, violent, stupid, and dumb, things like that. And that we also tend to have very specific stereotypes about people in high positions of power, or groups of people that we associate with high degrees of power. So you can take a look at the stereotypes associated with any given group, and it tends to map on fairly consistently to the power that they hold within a given society. Scapegoating is where prejudice and discrimination is directed to people with little power. So oftentimes where there's a minority group within a given society, that group can sometimes fall prey to scapegoating, where they become the target of a lot of negativity. They're blamed for society's problems, and they become the target of violence and aggression. This is sometimes what we see, especially with things like anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in the United States. There's many different theories about how we develop prejudice. Social cognitive theory states that prejudice is learned, modeled, and mimicked. This would indicate that we tend to learn from our surrounding society in terms of what we think and feel about different groups. And once again, stereotypes and prejudice are different from society to society. The prejudices that exist in Europe can sometimes be different from the prejudices that we have here. Likewise with the prejudices in other countries and areas as well. I remember when I moved from upstate New York to Iowa, for example, I was surprised by the anti-Semitism that was in Iowa. I grew up in a community that had a lot of Jewish folks. My neighborhood had a lot of Jewish people because the synagogue was right around the corner. And so I learned a lot about Jewish traditions, and many of my friends were Jewish in upstate New York. And I moved to Iowa when there were far fewer Jewish people. I was surprised by the sorts of jokes that I heard and associations that I heard about Jewish people hoarding money and being greedy and evil and all this other sort of stuff. And it took me by surprise. And communities that don't have a lot of exposure to certain groups can sometimes develop very odd stereotypes and prejudices as a result. My brother-in-law is Jewish, and his father served in the Korean War in the 60s, and he was in the Navy. And he woke up one day to find his bunkmates surrounding his bed. They were waiting to see if he grew horns in the middle of the night, because that was something that they believed Jewish people did. This was in the 1960s. This wasn't that long ago. People can sometimes hold very odd beliefs about other groups of people, especially if they haven't been exposed to them. Realistic conflict theory states that prejudice can develop because of a result of conflict. That conflict increases prejudice and discrimination. Things like scarce resources or differences in religious beliefs can sometimes fuel the sense of conflict, and once again, it can increase prejudice and discrimination. Social identity theory states that our group membership can sometimes be such an extension of ourselves that we need to feel a positive sense of self, and we do so by feeling positive about our group. And sometimes what this can result in is that we put other groups down in order to improve our self-esteem. One of the things we found through research is that when you increase someone's self-esteem, they tend to be less prejudiced. So bolstering self-esteem tends to reduce our need to put other groups down. And what we found through countless research is that people who tend to belong to groups that practice an extreme degree of prejudice, who belong to hate groups, for example, tend to not necessarily be very happy or very well adjusted when it comes to their sense of self-worth. And often that is why they feel a need to lash out towards others and express that hate. When it comes to overcoming prejudice, there's a few basic things that we found through our research. Once again, social psychology is not just studying a problem, but developing applied solutions. We found that educating people can often really help a great deal in reducing prejudice. A big one, though, is exposure. getting to know someone who's different from you, talking with them, getting to know them better as a person, and thinking of them as a person makes it a lot harder to hate them and to hate the group that they're associated with. So exposure and intergroup contact tends to be a classic way to reduce prejudice. Now, research shows that exposure under ideal conditions include cooperation rather than competition, and making sure that folks meet on a relatively even playing field, and that they discover things that they have in common, and that those tend to be ideal circumstances for reducing prejudice. One of the classic ways of thinking about reducing and overcoming prejudice is through a process known as recategorization. Recategorization is where you think of people who are different from you as being a part of your group. So you find something that you have in common, and then all of a sudden it's not, oh, you're one of those people, it's, oh, you're one of my people. I like that kind of music too. And once you recategorize someone so that they're a member of your group rather than a member of an out group, you actually think of them slightly differently. You're more likely to recognize how much variability your group has. You treat in-group members differently than you treat out-group members, and so thinking of someone as a member of your group actually changes the way you approach them and how you think about them cognitively. And finding common ground is a way to do that.